Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 122 of the Prancing Pony Podcast, where tonight, well, we're coming to you not quite live from deep in the heart of Texas.
That's right, folks. You probably remember us talking about being the keynote speakers at TexMoot, put on by the wonderful folks at Signum University earlier this year.
And we knew that we'd want to bring that content to you eventually. Streaming it live like we did for MythMoot wasn't an option, so we did our best to record the conversation, and now we're pleased to let you listen in.
Now, the sound quality may not be quite what you're accustomed to from us, but we're sure you'll enjoy the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, we had to use their mics. We couldn't, couldn't exactly bring ours, but we did what we could, and certainly the content's enjoyable. So, if nothing else, you can enjoy listener Ed P's wonderfully kind introduction.
Oh, that was great.
So here we go with the Prancing Pony Podcast live at TexMoot 2019.
So about 10 years ago, as I was paying a workman, he looked at the sting on my wall that's mounted, and he said, "Oh, you like the Lord of the Rings. Have you ever heard of the Tolkien Professor podcast?" And my response was, "What's a podcast?" And thus we are here. That's this story. And so when I first listened to Corey's podcast, he had a surprising attitude towards literature. Basically, read the words. And that, for a person who hadn't taken very many English courses in the past, that was just a revelation, the idea that you actually read the words. So I got involved with him for a while, and then I kept getting friends who pointed out that there's this other Tolkien podcast in the world. And I'm very partisan, right? If I'm on Corey's team, how could I possibly root for another Tolkien-related podcast because, I'm on Corey's team. And then I realized that you can root for two teams. It's not the NFL or the Major League Baseball where you have to have your own team. You can root for two teams. And so after I met these guys last summer at MythMoot 5, I thought, maybe I ought to listen to that because I only have 6 or 7 hours of Corey per week to listen to, so I have a little bit of extra time. So it took me about 3 months to motor through almost 3 years of, and their podcast, the Prancing Pony Podcast, takes a little bit more planned view of how to go through the literature than Corey, who is mostly off the cuff. They're also extremely loquacious, but not quite as loquacious as Corey. And of course, but they're united by their ability to bring in Monty Python references to their podcasts. And I personally love them, and they bring in all sorts of material from outside the text, looking into the text, both critical and archival, when they're looking at a particular passage. And they went through the Silmarillion, and then they went through the Hobbit, and now they're starting the Lord of the Rings. I think since they have, what's it called? Plan. Yeah, they have a plan. I think they're going to catch up to Corey at some point in somewhere around the Council of Elrond, and then there's going to be a giant, the Earth is going to be hit by a meteor or something. Either that or we're going to have a giant Tolkien Professor Prancing Pony mashup, 4-hour marathon. We're all looking forward to that. Anyway, so Serena has asked me to introduce these fellows who've seen before. The great Alan Sisto, who is the man of the West, because if he were any more West, he'd be in the ocean. And the Lord of the Mark here, Shawn Marchese. These people are the Prancing Pony Podcast.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Ed. That was
That
far
was
kinder than I thought it would be, and far kinder than we deserve. Half as kind as we thought it would be, and twice as kind as we deserve.
that works. I'll go with that. Yeah.
That's exactly what it is.
Thank you very much, Ed. Really appreciate that.
Well, folks, as he's already said, I am Alan Sisto, the man of the West.
And I am Shawn Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark.
We are the hosts of the Prancing Pony Podcast. We are a weekly podcast about the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. We want to start today first by thanking Serena Higgins, Corey Olson, and the whole team here at Signum University for inviting us here today and for allowing us to speak about the subject of how podcasts can build a community around a work of literature.
Yeah, we've been doing our podcast for nearly 3 years now. We started in February of 2016 to an audience of less than 200. And I think of those 200 people, I think a handful of them were some of our closest friends from a Facebook group. Mm-hmm. And the rest of them were just people basically just hoping we would fail miserably.
Train wreck.
Yeah.
That's why you stop on the freeway. You know, you want to see, wow, what happened to that?
What's going to happen here? And that's how we started. And although we only got through about half the material we wanted to in the first episode.
We had a plan, too. Yeah, we did only get through about half the material in that first episode. To paraphrase a well-known Hobbit, and we kind of just paraphrased him already, we covered less than half of it, half as well as we should have. We did keep at it. Our podcast began to grow, but we'll cover a little bit more of that in a moment.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a moment. A little bit more about our format. So our podcast format is part performance and part critical discussion. So we walk through Tolkien's works a chapter at a time, really more like 7 or 8 pages at a time, but we'll get into that in just a minute. We read selected passages of the text, we summarize the parts that we don't read, and then we discuss the work in as much detail as we can. And as Ed so graciously said, try and bring in as much stuff from outside to help sort of illuminate that work as possible.
Mostly because other people know a lot more than we do, but more on that coming up. But we'd actually like to start by reciting, well, I wouldn't like to start by reciting. I'd like to start by asking Shawn to recite an excerpt from a poem that some of you might recognize.
Well, and I should clarify that this is a translation of a few lines of a poem, so keep that in mind when trying to decide if you recognize it. And we are going to ask if you recognize it. And I haven't memorized it, folks. I'm sorry. We're podcasters. We're used to having our notes in front of us. Where is the horse gone? Where the young rider? Where now the giver of gifts? Where are the seats at the feasting gone? Where are the merry sounds in the hall? Alas, the bright goblet. Alas, the knight and his hauberk. Alas, the glory of the king. How that hour has departed, dark under the shadow of night, as had it never been.
Now, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that poem, but let's get a show of hands here. I mean, you recognize that. Okay. Quite a few people, most of you, or at least a good portion. It's a fragment from a 10th century Anglo-Saxon poem, originally written in Old English, which Shawn will kindly give us a sample of in a little bit, called The Wanderer. The translation is by J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, and it's from a draft that he gave as a valedictory address in 1959 when he retired from Oxford. Now, we chose Tolkien's translation, I should say, of that poem because we figured it was what people would expect of us. But, of course, there are many great ones. It's a very well-known Old English poem that's available in a bunch of translations. Many of you have heard it, especially if you've studied English literature at all, and especially if you've studied medieval English literature.
Yeah, and if you were familiar with it before today, when I just started reading it, you probably thought back to particular memories that you associate with that work while I was reading it. Maybe you thought of an undergraduate classroom where you heard it for the first time. Or maybe you thought of a book of poetry where you first read it. Or maybe you thought of an unbearable friend in college that you had who insisted on reciting this poem in Old English at parties. You know, where quam merg, where quam mago, where quam matham yifa.
Now you're just showing off.
I am trying to make a good impression. And I can't believe I did that in front of some of the people in this room.
Yeah, I'm impressed.
But I did practice, and I sound a little less like the Swedish chef.
You sound a lot less like the Swedish chef. Yeah. I also didn't hear a hint of gleeten, glauten, globen. Yeah.
None of the Def Leppard thing.
That's good.
So each one of us who knew that poem before walking into this room today probably has a different set of associations with it. For myself, personally, I can remember reading it for the first time in a sophomore English literature class that I took. I can still see my professor's face in my memory as he stands up in front of the classroom and talks about it much more competently than I would right now. And unrelated to the poem itself, I can remember my girlfriend, who is now my wife, sitting next to me in the class. It was the first class where I read Old English aloud, and because of that, when I think of Old English, I think of this. This was sort of my introduction to Old English, more so than something like Beowulf, which might be the case for a lot of other people. And I remember certain things that my professor told us about the poem, probably things that some of you know as well, the fact that it's an elegy from the Exeter book, or that it's a classic example of that really awesome Latin phrase, ubi sunt, this sort of, where are they, this sort of yearning repetition of, things that have faded, things that have gone before. I'm sure many of you who know the poem know some of these things already, and I guess we're not up here to talk about The Wanderer. We're not up here to teach a course on The Wanderer, but the point we're trying to make
good
is
heavens,
that...
we're not qualified for that.
No, we certainly aren't. But the point that I'd like to make with that is that because each of us has read that poem separately at different times in our lives, different circumstances that we brought to it, we all come to the poem as individuals with gaps in our knowledge and gaps in our experience that separate us. There's a community there in the sense that we are all people who know that poem, and we're all people who, appreciate that poem, but we don't really have a communal experience of that poem. And I think that communal experience, divides us, even though we are a community. Or the lack of communal experience divides us, even though we are a community.
Exactly. Now, some of you may be more familiar with this poem. Where now the horse and the rider? Where is the horn that was blowing? Where is the helm and the hauberk and the bright hair flowing? Where is the hand on the harp string and the red fire glowing? Where is the spring and the harvest and the tall corn growing? They have passed like rain on the mountain, like a wind in the meadow. The days have gone down in the west behind the hills into shadow. Who shall gather the smoke of the dead wood burning, or behold the flowing years from the sea returning?
So who knows that one? Show of hands on that one.
Yeah, a little better.
Yeah, a little bit more than the one that I read before. That is a poem by J.R.R. Tolkien from The Lord of the Rings, which is very obviously inspired by the passage from The Wanderer that I read just a moment ago. In the book, it's Book 3, Chapter 6, The King of the Golden Hall, the character of Aragorn, for anybody who doesn't know, the character of Aragorn recites that poem for his companions, Legolas the elf and Gimli the dwarf, to explain to them the culture of the Rohirrim, which are a human culture based in part on the Anglo-Saxons, and that sort of explains Tolkien's use of the Wanderer as a model.
It certainly does. If you know Tolkien's work, then you probably have a host of personal memories and associations with this poem. Maybe the first time you read the book, or maybe you already knew that this poem was inspired by the Old English, The Wanderer, that we talked about, and you connect those two in your mind. Or maybe you recall seeing the film adaptation from Peter Jackson, in which it's not Aragorn, but Theoden, who recites a shortened version of the poem in a dramatic scene near the climax of the film.
Or you may remember being part of a packed theater at midnight watching that movie and being one of a dozen or so people who stood up and cheered when Theoden recited that poem, although I'm not speaking from personal experience.
Sure you're not. I believe you.
You should.
But once again, each of us has our own set of experiences that define our relationship to that poem. You might be part of the community that's read Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and the smaller sub-community that didn't skip the poetry. Shame on you if you're not a part of that smaller sub-community.
That actually read the poetry, yeah.
No, if you're not, well, yeah, we want you to be a part of the, don't skip the poetry is kind of the point. I'm guilty of that. I did that the first
You were
few times.
guilty of
Yeah,
that.
I know, I've confessed.
You don't do it
What
anymore.
do I need to do, penance? What?
No,
I mean,
you don't do it. I'm saying you don't do it anymore.
No, I don't skip it anymore. I read it all the time now. And if it's alliterative, I read it twice.
If it's alliterative, you insist on you reading it.
Yeah, that's true. You get Arundel, I get the
Yeah.
alliteration. You might be part of the larger community that's familiar with the poem from the movie. I mean, that's just a reality. Or you may be part of a very small community, maybe a group of friends who saw the movie at a particular time, at a particular place, and you have memories of that. But we all come to it here today as individuals, and we as a group don't have a communal experience. Well, we didn't until now.
Right.
But yeah, we don't have a communal experience of the poem.
Right. So now back to the Prancing Pony podcast. We are primarily a Tolkien book podcast, not a Lord of the Rings movie podcast. So we're not here to talk about watching the movie either. We've been doing this podcast for about 3 years, as I said, and we've been releasing weekly episodes for about the last year and a half of that.
Yeah. And our typical podcast format's roughly a 100-minute show. I mean, sometimes it's an hour and a half, sometimes it's 2 hours, sometimes it's 3.
It has been 3 in the
Yeah,
past.
it won't be again. That was a season 1 error, a little rookie mistake. But
flying too close to the sun.
Very much so. The 3-part Turin trilogy that was 7 hours.
Probably should have been 5 parts.
Probably. As Corey said when we had him on the show, you might be going a little
fast. We might have
fast.
rushed to the Silmarillion.
Yeah. I mean, even though it was like 46 episodes and something like 98 hours of content, you're like, it might be a little fast.
Yeah.
He was right. We might actually have to go back and redo
We may have to go back and redo it someday.
Yeah, like when we're like 63 or something like that. But So, now we do about 7 or 8 pages at a time. We read selected passages. We do our best dramatic dialogue performances. We talk about the story. We call out important themes, the recurring themes. We call out recurring images.
Yeah, we make connections to other stories in Tolkien's Legendarium. We talk about some of Tolkien's inspirations in mythology, linguistics, theology, philosophy.
Mm-hmm. And we search through all of Tolkien's published works, not only the Legendarium itself, but things like the letters and the biographies, I should say, from several different authors. Mm-hmm.
And scholarly works by,
people
some people
here
in this room, actually, as well as others.
Uh-huh. And all to give our listeners the information and insight that, as much as we can, to help them understand the text.
Yeah. And from time to time, we take a break from that usual format, and we actually interview a person of interest, somebody that our listeners would be interested in, scholars who've done important academic work on Tolkien, including, again, some people in this room. We've had artists on, or we plan to, actually. We've even had a chance to interview Simon Tolkien, J.R.R.'s grandson, who's a writer himself. And we also make very silly jokes and very goofy pop culture references, usually involving other things that we're extremely nerdy about, and there are many.
There are indeed. During the 3 years we've been doing this, something very interesting has happened along the way, something we didn't expect. We've seen a community build up around the show. A community of people from all over the world, and I'm still blown away by how many countries our shows are downloaded in, who are fans of Tolkien's work, who find the same things about it interesting as we do, and who not always, but at least sometimes find the same things funny that we do. We've gotten a few bad reviews on the dad jokes.
We have gotten a few bad reviews on the dad. Well, we're dads. What are we going to do?
What are we going to do?
It's what comes naturally. Be yourself, right?
Right,
That's what Corey told us to do. But
next time we get a bad review, we'll just say Corey told us to be ourselves.
Corey told us to be ourselves, and we are very nerdy dads. So a good example of that, or a very bad example of that, maybe, but maybe a funny example. If you follow us on Twitter, does anybody follow us on Twitter?
Oh, goodness, I know where you're going.
Yeah.
And not just because I have notes in front of me either.
If anybody has been following us on Twitter for several years, you may remember a day long ago it was late in 2016.
The first year we were doing the show.
It was the first year we were doing the show. We were having a conversation on Twitter with about 4 or 5 of our followers, and we decided to tweet out a couple of impromptu lines of a new parody version of The Wanderer about Scooby-Doo. And the 2 lines went, "Where is the hound gone? Where the hippie? Hopeless we wait. We have some work to do now." The 2 lines went.
And that's why I hired him, folks. That was all you. I'm not taking the blame or credit for that one.
And what it was an attempt to write the first ever Scooby Sunt poem.
That was all you. I'm not taking the blame or credit.
You did. You kind of had to be there.
Yeah, well, okay, you probably weren't there, and it might have been just as well that you weren't. But that would make you, of course, not a part of that little tiny sub-community, that very unfortunate community. We didn't have very many Twitter followers at the time, and Twitter being the kind of place that it is, well, things like that get lost almost immediately.
And that's a good thing.
It is, yeah.
And you should consider yourself lucky if you don't think of my silly Scooby Sunt joke when you think of The Wanderer. However, now that I've shared that with you all, maybe you will. And I am sorry. But what that does,
so am I.
What that does, aside from possibly change future experiences of that poem, and not necessarily in a good way, what that does is it creates a new community with that shared communal experience and that shared association around that particular work of literature.
And I'm going to go off notes here and say that so does the T-shirt that several people are wearing, the inside joke about Schrodinger's dwarves.
That's right.
That was a one-off gag when we were in that chapter of The Hobbit, and we were just talking about, Bilbo didn't know whether they were alive or dead, and I just kind of off the cuff said, they're like Schrodinger's dwarves. Yeah. And it's
they're both until you open the lid of the barrel.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. The absolute possibility exists that they are dead or alive. Yeah. So we decided we'd make that a shirt, and that's part of our community now in a very literal sense.
Yeah.
So when we record this talk, which we're doing now, and we release it on our podcast feed, which probably won't happen for a while, we'll be inviting all of our listeners, even those who aren't here today, into that community who now think of that terrible joke when they hear The Wanderer.
And they're all welcome if they're listening right now. And even better, people who find our podcast a year from now or 2 years from now, when they catch up to this episode, they will become part of that community as well. that community experience will become, and this is such a new media buzzword, evergreen. And newcomers to the community can become fully a part of it with all the shared experiences as those who came before.
Our Christmas special is evergreen.
Yes,
though.
it
I like
is.
that. Yeah,
that was a clever use of that.
That was
evergreen.
If I'm going to have to use a new media word like evergreen, I'm going to use it right.
Yeah.
So anyway, the whole idea of that shared experience is the point. I mean, suddenly you didn't have to be there. You know, the podcast format opens the door to everyone who wants to enter at whenever time they want. And in time, that community will grow beyond the 5,000 or 6,000 people that are part of it today.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, I mean, communities around literature are nothing new. We've heard a lot of people talking about communities around literature all day today, and it's been really cool to hear. And chances are everyone actually in this room right now has been a part of at least one community surrounding a work of literature in their life.
They kind of are just by
They
being
kind of are
here.
just by being here. That's true. But you've probably also been a part of a fan club or a literary society. For example, Alan and I are both members of the Tolkien Society. You may have been part of a group of colleagues specializing in a particular academic field, maybe focusing on a particular author. A book club, which often seems like a kind of an analogy to what we do, don't you think? In a way. Or just a circle of really nerdy teenagers obsessed with a particular series of fantasy novels.
That might actually be a more accurate analogy.
Of us.
We've certainly been a part of many of those. Even geographically separated communities around a work of literature, like the people who are in on Shawn's Scooby-Doo joke. I almost can't bring myself to say it. Even those.
You almost can't bring yourself to call it a joke, really.
Well, no, yeah. There are air quotes around that if I didn't have my hands full. But even geographically separated communities aren't that new. I mean, a decade or so ago, when the internet seemed to consist of nothing but various forums, there were large and active groups discussing Tolkien. They've taken off in recent years on social media now. We see them on Facebook groups, and of course, that's something close to our hearts because that's how we connected,
right, yeah.
And that's where the podcast was birthed, if you will. But it's not unique to Tolkien either. It doesn't take long to find Facebook groups dedicated to maybe my second favorite author, say Isaac Asimov, or maybe Douglas Adams, or your second favorite, which would be the Dune series from Frank Herbert. Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Jane Austen, whatever, they're everywhere.
Yeah. And I would say even communities surrounding the oral performance of literature, which is something that a podcast allows that a book maybe does not, those aren't new either by a long shot. They're probably as old as oral literature itself. I'm pretty sure the ancient Greeks did not have audiobooks. They gathered in groups to listen to a singer, and aoidos, I think I'm saying that right.
Thank you for trying that word. I didn't want to try that word.
To listen to them sing a poem live, and that created a shared experience of that poem.
But because we're geeks for all things medieval at the Prancing Pony podcast, our favorite example is the medieval Germanic or Anglo-Saxon Mead-Hall. And that's really, now that it's only taken us 27 minutes to get to that, that's the point of our keynote address, is that the podcast is a digital Mead-Hall.
A digital Mead-Hall, yeah.
So the Mead-Hall in Anglo-Saxon society was the center of political and social life, the main place where the community came together. It was where all the significant events and gatherings of the community's life took place. It was the place, and I'm quoting here Karl Wintersdorf.
Yeah, that's the one.
It was the place where the daily feast was held, healths drunk, speeches made, stories told, and harps played. The furnishings were simple, including 2 high seats and several mead benches decorated with gold. When the nightly storytelling and music were over and the king had retired, the benches were cleared away, the floor was spread with bedding and bolsters, and the thanes settled down to rest.
Now, of course, as the name Mead-Hall implies, the consumption of strong beverages and feasting was an important part of that sense of community. But equally important was the sense of the Mead-Hall as a place to gather for entertainment, such as listening to songs and oral storytelling. The poet, or Schope, was typically a resident poet, like the one we see appear in the lines of Beowulf, in Hrothgar's Hall of Heorot, who celebrates Beowulf's victories by singing songs about great heroes like Siegmund the Dragon Slayer, and not-so-great kings like Heremod, and ancestral heroes like the Frisian king Finn. And these were stories that most of the people in that Mead-Hall had heard before. But these Schopes were important figures to the community in pre-literate societies, or maybe I should not use that term after hearing
the papers we listened to.
And hearing Corey's thoughts on that as well. They acted as the communal memory of the group, the custodian of their legends, myths, and history, their traditions and folkways. And that's a quote from Stephen Pollington.
And I think I'm continuing a quote when I say that when they performed, they engaged all who were present, unifying the audience and equalizing them. We've talked about democratization. It's the same kind of thing. From the greatest thanes to the folks in the cheap seats, from the wisest old advisors to the younger listeners hearing these stories for the first time, all of them were part of the same audience.
And hearing these stories together as a group, and no doubt talking about them, had to create a powerful sense of community and shared experience for those people.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, in Beowulf, Hrothgar's Mead-Hall of Heorot is equated with the community itself in some very important ways. There cannot be a community without a Mead-Hall, as evidenced by the fact that the first thing Hrothgar does when he becomes a king is to build a Mead-Hall. Now, this comes from Tolkien's translation of Beowulf, which it is a prose translation, but we use it because, well, it's Tolkien, and it's pretty faithful to the Old English, at least as far as we understand it. Thereafter was fortune in war vouchsafed to Hrothgar, and glory in battle, that the vassals of his own kindred hearkened willingly unto him, and the numbers of his young warriors grew to a mighty company of men. Then it came into his heart that he would command men to fashion a hall and a mansion, a mightier house for their mead drinking than the children of men had ever known, and there within would he apportion all things to young and old, such as God had granted him, save the people's land and the lives of men.
Now, once built, the Mead-Hall of Heorot, with its light and its revelry, it stands in contrast to the uncivilized world outside, the world where Grendel lives. It stands as a symbol of everything Grendel hates and does not have, as an outcast living in the moors beyond. And it's not just the hall, but specifically the sound of the singing and the storytelling that reminds Grendel of how much he is not a part of that community, and that's what incites him to attack. Reading again from Tolkien's translation of Beowulf. Then the fierce spirit that abode in darkness grievously endured a time of torment, in that day after day he heard the din of revelry echoing in the hall. There was the sound of harp and the clear singing of the minstrel. There spake he that had knowledge to unfold from far-off days the first beginning of men, telling how the Almighty wrought the earth, a veil of bright loveliness that the waters encircle. How triumphant he set the radiance of the sun and moon as a light for the dwellers in the lands, and adorned the regions of the world with boughs and with leaves. Life, too, he devised for every kind that moves and lives. Even thus did the men of that company live in mirth and happiness, until one began to work deeds of wrong, a fiend of hell. Grendel was that grim creature called, the ill-famed haunter of the marches of the land, who kept the moors, the fastness of the fens, and, unhappy one, inhabited long while the troll-kind's home, for the Maker had prescribed him with the race of Cain.
Now, there's a real contrast there between light and dark, between mirth in the hall and grimness, but also between community and lack of community. And for Grendel, it's the sound of the singing of the shope that's the clearest sign of community. It is that singing that brings the people in Hrothgar's hall together, and thus it is a symbol of all that Grendel doesn't have, and that is what drives him to violence. Or as our favorite author J.R.R. Tolkien said in his seminal essay, Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, Grendel is maddened by the sound of harps.
Now, fast-forwarding ahead to the 20th or the 21st century, and I guess depending on how flexible you want to be with your definition of literature, you can probably think of lots of modern examples of communities that formed specifically with the purpose of sharing and discussing literature.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to put air quotes around literature for some of these examples, but, you know, when we were kids, there were only a few channels available on TV. Pretty much everybody was watching the same things at the same time. The old cliche of gathering around the water cooler and talking about the MASH finale or Who Shot J.R., maybe the Seinfeld finale, so that we're not totally dating ourselves, is entirely well known. But it's really, the thing is, that's no longer the case with the rise of cable and, 8,000 channels and these streaming services like Netflix and Amazon Prime. There's so much entertainment selection that just doesn't happen anymore. A group of people gathered for a non-media consuming reason, like people in an office, they're much less likely to share common media interests now. Now, I know it's a bit of an oversimplification. I mean,
Sure.
I admit that,
Yeah.
but people still gather around the water cooler to discuss reality TV or Monday Night Football or something like that, or certainly the news. But those aren't narratives. We'd argue that it's more like discussing current events.
Yeah, but we do continue to see communities form around common interests in literature and other narrative media in places online, in Facebook groups, in forums for specific books and movies and fandoms and so on. Online communities exist for pretty much any fandom, property, or work of literature you can imagine, and Alan named
And
a few
probably
just a
some you
moment
shouldn't imagine.
Probably so. And yes, some people like to podcast about their favorite works of literature.
Yes, they do.
And some people like to listen to them, I guess.
Thankfully, they do. Now, if you're a fan of a media property that's still ongoing, still developing, maybe Game of Thrones or Star Wars or Vikings, and assuming you're up to date with the latest episodes, you can find a community around that and easily start getting involved, start having that shared experience, that community, because it's something that's still coming out every week or every quarter or whenever they release them. People in the community are discovering it together, just like in that old water cooler model.
But with an established work like Tolkien's Legendarium, it's harder to achieve that sense of common experience and thus common identity. There are experience gaps within the community that create differences between people who have, for example, read Lord of the Rings every year for 25 years and somebody who's reading it for the first time.
Yeah. I mean, there are differences between those who read it once 5 years ago as opposed to those who are reading it now and have the language of the text fresh in their minds, instead of relying on memories of what they read a long time ago that almost inevitably get conflated with memories of the films.
Right. And there are also differences between those who have read most or all of the material out there, like not just The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but also The Silmarillion and The Unfinished Tales and all 12 volumes of History of Middle-earth, and all the secondary works by folks like Tom Shippey and Corey Olsen and the biographies and all of that stuff.
And if you'll forgive a brief digression, which I think will help us illustrate the point, unlike our usual digressions, which anybody who's listened to us know they don't really illustrate the point very well. About a year ago, we interviewed Professor Michael Drought on our show. He's a very well-known medievalist and Tolkien scholar, maybe not at the level of the Tolkien professor, but sorry. Because that line came from Michael Drought, I had to say it.
Yeah, he told us that story,
yeah. Now, one of the things we did to prepare for our interview with him was to watch a fantastic lecture he has up on YouTube called How to Read J.R.R. Tolkien, which we highly recommend. It's only about an hour long. It's easy to find with a search online, and I think we also included a link to it in our show notes for our interview with him.
And that was episode 66 of our show, I believe?
Yes. Yeah.
So, a slaying song tonight.
A slaying song tonight. It was released around Christmas, and so we felt that was appropriate, but not spelled that way. Anyway, in that lecture, Drought speaks of an epistemic regime, a distribution of knowledge within the Lord of the Rings, whereby the characters know more about the world than the reader does, and some characters know more than others. He says, the characters know a fair bit more than the readers do because they live in Middle-earth. Things that are unknown to the reader are going to be obvious to the characters, but not all the characters know everything about their own world. Now, he's making a point about how Tolkien uses the point of view of the least knowledgeable character for narrative effect. But to get back to our point, I bring that up to illustrate that there is an epistemic regime within the community as well. There's a difference between what some readers of a work know and what others know.
And I think that often the vast amount of information that's possessed by the most knowledgeable in the community can act as a sort of barrier of entry for the least knowledgeable people in the community. At a minimum, it can be very intimidating for newcomers to the community, and I think it keeps newcomers from gelling with the community as a whole, and maybe even scares them away from exploring some of those.
We see that
works.
in some of the Facebook groups. Some super knowledgeable person will pop in and go off, and then they just kind of disappear like, I shouldn't have said anything.
Right, yeah. And so an equalizer is needed, something or someone like the Shope and the Mead-Hall who can connect everybody together, who can get everybody on the same page, whether they're playing to not only the newbies, but also the wise old thanes who know the whole history behind names like Siamund and Heremod, or in our case, Sauron and Hurin. And in our experience, a podcast like ours can be that equalizer. It can play the role of the Shope, singing to the Mead-Hall.
When we read through a text like The Lord of the Rings on our podcast, we encourage our listeners to read along with us. We break it up into very small chunks that are getting smaller, it seems, every week. We read and discuss 7 or 8 pages of this, 1,000-page story in a single week. Now, we do that because we have a tendency to be long-winded, and I know all things are relative, Corey, but, relatively speaking. And it's the only way we can keep ourselves to less than 2 hours an episode, which ever since season 1, we've decided. Yeah. I think that one time when we were up until, I think it was 1 in the morning my time, which is 3 in the morning your time.
My time, because we
are never doing this again.
We recorded 2+
It was our tour.
Episode.
It was our
in
we,
one
we
night.
Did 2 2-hour episodes in a single night.
Yeah.
So we do smaller chunks now, and we do that because of that long-winded tendency. But it's had a really nice side effect by breaking the text up into these small chunks. It creates that equalizer effect by getting all of our listeners and fellow readers on the same page, literally.
Yeah, literally. And
that's the correct use of the word literally. People,
yes,
that is one of my pet
That's not
peeves.
Figuratively.
That
is not figuratively.
That is How many of you want to just, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Nicely done.
Yeah.
You know your audience. And then when our show comes out every Sunday morning and we talk about those 7 to 8 pages and we read passages from them, we create a further shared experience, a shared experience of the auditory quality of the text being read aloud, the music of the language, the alliteration, the poetry, the interesting character voices when we can achieve them, which you usually can.
We can achieve them.
No, that was just a small taste of my Ungoliant. I won't do them here, but there's a lot of fun with those. But
we have had a lot of fun.
We have a shared experience of the commentary discussed, themes that were brought out, references to inspirations and influences that Tolkien may have been thinking of.
And a shared experience of the same silly jokes that we brought up. And pop culture references, too, because nothing brings a bunch of nerds together like a well-placed Monty Python.
Or an entire version of the Swamp Castle skit as played by Ungoliant and Treebeard.
Which, yeah, that was a classic.
That was a lot of fun.
And we cut that, actually.
We did. That ended up in our blooper
outtakes.
reel. Yeah, it wouldn't end up in our blooper reel these days. It would end up in the show.
Yeah, it would. Furthermore, when we actually get serious and talk about the literature about the literature, to borrow a quote from Tolkien about from the beginning of his essay on Beowulf, we equalize knowledge gaps in that epistemic regime that Alan was talking about. I think we've done that a lot through our interview episodes by helping some of our listeners connect with some of the leading scholars in Tolkien studies today.
Yeah.
But I even think through our regular read-through episodes, we reference secondary sources about the text. We bring in insights from scholars that are relevant to understanding the section of the text that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we've heard from lots of our listeners that we, of all people, introduced them to the work of scholars in the Tolkien studies academic sphere that they weren't familiar with before, which is frankly mind-boggling.
That someone would have heard of us.
Someone would have heard of us.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, before they heard of Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull or John Garth or I don't know this Corey is it Olsen? Anyway.
Honestly, I think most of our listeners probably knew him already because he did beat us to the Tolkien podcast.
By a few years and about 27 million downloads,
Yeah.
It's true, but we really have been amazed to see how many people knew Tolkien's works, but not many of the works about Tolkien. And they've discovered those works about Tolkien through our show, and that's really helped them understand the material, the book itself, much, much better.
Yeah, and I think because of that, we've helped people get through some of the more challenging or more esoteric works by Tolkien that they never thought they could read or should read. I mean, we've heard from people who had never tried to read the Silmarillion or who had tried and stopped multiple times and listened to our show, and then they made it through.
And they made it through, absolutely.
Or we've heard from people who never would have thought about reading something really obscure, like Tolkien's Father Christmas Letters.
Well, that's not really obscure. Songs for the Philologists is probably a little more
obscure.
Well,
that's probably most obscure, I guess. But to the mainstream audience, something like Father Christmas Letters, because we haven't talked about songs for the Philologists.
No, I know. We haven't, and we probably won't.
No.
Since you and I won't be able to get a
Since
copy
we can't
of that.
get a copy of
Since
it.
You'd have to sell your house, I'd have to sell my house, so we'd have to pool the money together to buy a copy.
Right.
But anyway.
But people have, come to us and said, I never heard of the Father Christmas Letters.
No.
I never would have thought of reading it. But you guys talked about it in your Christmas episode, and now I've read it. And usually people are happy that they did. They like
especially that one.
Yeah,
that's a great example.
That is such a good one.
It really is. And through that, a community has formed around us with the help of our social media spaces to bring listeners into contact with each other. That community has given all these listeners a place to come together to talk about these works, not just with us, which is fine, but with each other. We never imagined something like that would happen around our podcast. We just thought that, I don't know, maybe a couple dozen of our closest friends would enjoy listening to us to talk about elves and make nerdy Python jokes.
Yeah. But our community has even experienced its own sort of zeitgeist around Tolkien's works.
Now you're using fancy words again.
I am. By creating a shared experience of a particular part of the
story.
This is
Bobby, you want to go off script?
No, it's fine. We go off script. That's what we do. We digress.
We do.
By it's more the cough that bothered me.
Okay, fair enough.
By creating a shared experience of a particular part of the story at a certain time and place, we've actually helped kickstart conversations about a particular moment in the story or a particular topic or a theme. When we talk about a certain chapter or a topic in the book, we do frequently see people in our community, people who we know listen to us, go out and start talking about that part of the story in other communities there and on Facebook or elsewhere. It's like everyone is re-engaging with the work at the same point again, regardless of whether they've read the book, twice before in their lives or 20.
Exactly. I mean, we've seen listeners raise a question in a Facebook group about specific concepts or maybe unanswered questions that we've raised on our show and seen the idea go, I don't know, viral, certainly an exaggeration. I mean, I don't know, small scale viral, right? I mean, I don't know. It's I don't know what it's not retrovirus, but yeah.
That's what everybody's going to think I have if I cough again like that.
There are still some people out there who know the work and all the literature about the literature, as Tolkien said, better than others, and some of them certainly know it better than we do. but everyone's talking about it with a common language and a common context based on how we've discussed it on the show. There's a shared experience there. We've kind of accidentally coined words and phrases on our show that seem to go out there and take on a life of their own, like my favorite, SPBMI. That's just an acronym pronounced out. It's SPBMI, and it's short for Shall Prove But Mine Instrument. It's simply our shorthand way to refer to Iluvatar's sovereign ability to weave even the evil acts of somebody like Melkor into his music and the ultimate plan.
Yeah. And we've seen concepts or chapters we've talked about on our show in a given week suddenly start appearing in blogs online.
Like every time we talk about Feanor.
Yeah. There are a lot of really, really good independent
Where's
blogs.
The crack? Somebody she
the whack,
at least
the
got
pinata.
the whack of the pinata there.
There are some really great independent blogs out there on Tolkien's works, and some of their authors listen to us. And occasionally we will see some of them address a question that we've talked about on the show.
Yeah.
We've seen blog posts pop up on things as silly as how do elves smell?
Yes.
To our guest appearances by folks like Tom Shippey. We've seen bloggers say that they were inspired by something we said to tackle a particular topic. Some of those have turned into papers that were presented at conferences. And we've seen other bloggers respond to them, creating a conversation that about that topic that we're not even really a part of. And that is really cool.
It is.
Because, it's showing that community at work. It's showing those people now connecting with each other because of something that just showed up on our show. And,
exactly.
And we don't usually get in the middle of that. We
no.
Unless we're admitting we were wrong about something,
which happens more often than it should. But and we know we're not the only ones. Of course, I mean we often hear from listeners, multiple listeners in a given week, asking us for our thoughts on a topic that's been raised in Corey Olson's weekly Exploring the Lord of the Rings webinars. I think they ask us because they want an answer sometime before 2017. I'm sorry, 2070 is what I meant to say.
I was going to say, what year do you think it is? Yeah,
I'm counting backwards. When you get to 3000, it goes backwards. I truly meant 2070, and I said 17. I must be tired. I am still on California time.
You are.
So
you've been soldiering
I did
on
not
pretty
sleep well. Anyway.
Yeah.
People ask us for our thoughts on Corey Olson's stuff, and our response is always the same. We say whatever Corey said is right. We're just here to make Monty Python jokes,
and then we'll just usually go nee. So I suppose that you could argue that a lot of
carry it by the husks.
All right, where did you get the coconuts?
All right.
We could do this all night.
We
won't. Now, I suppose you could argue that a lot of the characteristics that we're talking about that form around our literature podcasting community or Corey's literature podcasting community are common to other types of communities that form around literature, like book clubs or social media groups. So I think it's worth asking the question, what does podcasting bring to the equation that's unique? What does podcasting do that makes a community around a podcast different from other types of communities around a work of literature? And I think there are two things. I think the first one is the oral performance aspect of it. When we read excerpts from the book we're talking about, that creates an appreciation for the work being read aloud, which is something that a lot of people don't really get to experience that frequently.
No, you're right. I mean, we've heard from listeners before that no matter how many times they've read it, that they never picked up on the musicality or the rhythm or the alliteration of a passage of Tolkien's work, especially his prose work, where that stuff can kind of be
sort of
subtly hidden, right? Until we read it out loud on the show. And frankly, I think we've picked up on a few things ourselves by reading it aloud. Like I didn't catch certain things as I'm preparing the notes.
That
when
you
read
suddenly
it out loud,
are reading
wow,
it,
whoa, wait, did you just
wow,
hear that?
There's like a ton of alliteration in that passage. Where there's just a real musicality to it. I actually never read any of Tolkien's books aloud until 6 years ago.
Wow.
When my son was born, I read it aloud I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings aloud to my son when he was a newborn. He couldn't fight back. And it was more for me than for him, but he enjoyed just hearing my voice. And I was...
Are you sure about that?
As far as I know.
Okay. He does still live with you.
He did stop crying, which as opposed to now when I talk about Lord of the Rings and he starts crying.
Yeah, that's about right.
But when I read it to him aloud, I was struck for the first time in my life by just the power of the language being read aloud, the poetry and the music of the words, not just the music of the poetry, but the music of the prose. Reading it aloud for the first time, and I don't have to go into how old I am and how old I was, but for the first time in a long time, after reading that book for some 20 years at the time,
So you're at least 20?
Yes. That was the first time that I had really taken something new from that work in a long time. And that was, I think, just something that really struck me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, reading it aloud made me fall in love with it again. I don't even want to say this next thing. After getting married in 1992, I was a child husband. I was 11 years old. I stopped my annual reading of The Lord of the Rings. I mean, you're starting a new life, and you're kind of setting some things aside.
You get into girls, and you stop reading Lord of the Rings so much.
No. Finally had one say yes to a date, and the next thing you know, I'd maybe read it twice between 1992 and 2000 when we learned of the upcoming film release.
Okay, yeah.
Which is really sad considering that I supposedly know a lot about it. I mean, I had read it at least once a year every year before that for many, many years. And, of course, I've read it, I don't know how many times since then. Well, yeah, I started reading it when I was 3. No. But here's the thing. I told my wife that before she sees the movies, because she'd never read the books, that we have to read the books. And she wanted to read while I read aloud. So she would follow in her copy while I read aloud. And it was the first time that I'd done that. And I have to say, it brought the books alive in a whole new way. And, we're able to share some of that experience with others who may have read the book dozens of times but have never heard it read aloud. And at least they've never heard it read aloud by us, but that may be a good thing.
At a minimum, they've never heard it read aloud by us, and that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about what our podcast brings to to that equation. That's a little bit different.
A common experience.
And that does create a unique common experience. What we bring to it specifically, whether it's character voices that Alan brings to the dialogue, and maybe that'll bring some of those characters to life in a new way for some of the listeners. Some of our commentary, some of our jokes, some of the specific themes we decide to highlight, the references to other works, the inspirations, all that creates that shared experience. And I don't know, after listening to us talk about something for 90 to 100 minutes at a time, all of our listeners kind of know the same things about the work that we do, which is not a lot. But we do know.
I'll bash us pretty good, but I won't bash how hard we work at it.
That's true. No, the work that we do, to pull out all those mythological sources, the interesting linguistic points and all that stuff, or they've heard the ridiculous joke that we thought of while referencing a particular thing like the Gollum GPS that we
that was
came
a
up with
classic.
One day when Gollum was trying to get out of that tunnel.
Yeah, seriously, that's a must. That's a must listen. I'm almost tempted to break out the. Maybe
later.
Let's get through the actual rest of the keynote. But the other thing about podcasts that makes the community different, and this is really an intrinsic aspect of the technology that makes them possible, and it's the evergreen nature of the feed. There's that word again. Podcasts only became possible really about 15 years ago when the technology became available to push audio files through an RSS feed. Now, not only does this allow us to release content to subscribers directly on their devices every week, but it also means we can keep all of those episodes online in chronological order for anyone to discover later.
Yeah, and so that's how people can discover a podcast now, by word of mouth online or through an iTunes search, and go back to the beginning and listen to all those episodes from number 1, which, as I said earlier, we've released almost 3 years ago.
Like Ed was talking about. Now, we sometimes wish they wouldn't go all the way back to episode 1, but we've talked about the fact that those early episodes were a little rough. Content was there. I didn't know you. You didn't know me.
Right, yeah. There were a lot of things with our comfort level, but people did go back and listen to them.
And I'm glad they did.
And a lot of them have kept going. I'm always amazed to hear that people go back and binge our show to catch up, just like you would with a show on Netflix. I'm like,
pretty wild.
Go do that with, a show on, on Netflix or Amazon Prime. You binge us, and people like Ed listening to hours and hours of us talking a day.
I feel like I owe you something for your pain and suffering, But that's what makes this evergreen. It's a nice new media buzzword. We've talked about that. It's content that's not time dependent, right? If we started doing a podcast on current events, well, a month from now, that's not going to be interesting.
Right.
But this stuff, people are going to love this for years to come, we hope. Not only is our content evergreen, but people will always be interested in going back and reading Tolkien, but the community we create around it is also evergreen, and that's what's really interesting. People who go back and binge those episodes today now join in with that shared experience with the people who've been listening for 3 years.
Yeah, and they'll understand the jargon that we use and the references that we make to those other works.
They'll get all of our jokes, or at least the funny ones. Yeah. They'll know very quickly which pop culture properties we just can't help referencing in every episode.
Which have been made painfully obvious in this segment so far.
Yeah, they really have. They'll hear the same alliteration, the same voices that we bring to the characters. They'll understand our commentary just like they were listening from the very beginning, because really they have, just in a different time.
Right. So they can actually join our community and get up to speed any time. whether they were part of that community from the very beginning or whether they're just now getting caught up. And we think that is something new. We think that is something that's unique to podcasting, and we've really been happy to be a part of it.
Yeah.
So I guess yeah, I know. I didn't think of a way to transition into this section, but you know, we do usually refer to our online community as our common room. That's, for those of you who know Lord of the Rings, we're borrowing a phrase from Lord of the Rings about the Prancing Pony Inn, which of course is where we got our name from.
There's a lot of Prancing Pony references in the show. The North Wing,
right?
Questions After Nightfall is kind of at the gate. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But aside from common room, there are other analogies to what podcasters do that can be drawn as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some people have said that listening to us is like listening to two guys talking about Tolkien on a park bench. I'm kind of hoping we're not homeless in this particular analogy, but you never know. Sitting at a pub, listening to your friends talk about the Lord of the Rings. I like that one.
That's a fun one.
Hanging out with a bunch of nerdy grad students making jokes and playing D&D. Suddenly I feel a lot younger.
I really like that one.
Yeah. I haven't been a grad student in a very long time. Or, in this one we don't really deserve, but somebody said that it's like being Merry and Pippin hiding under the table listening to Elrond and Gandalf talk.
We really don't deserve that. But thank you to the person who said that. But we do sometimes feel like we have created a digital Mead-Hall, that our weekly podcast talking about our favorite book is like us singing to a room full of people.
Oh, heavens, no
not
singing,
literally
please.
singing, except when we do occasionally sing.
Yeah, that's true. We do. I forget about that.
The people in our audience might be coming to Tolkien's work for the first time, or they may be very familiar with the story, like the audience listening to the Shope singing about Finn and Siamund and Heremod.
Right.
But all of those people are experiencing it together as a community.
That's right. And then they can come together to talk about the work either in a social media space or on the podcast itself.
Yeah, I mean, we welcome some of our listeners into our virtual studio.
Well, yeah.
To join us online for quarterly live Q&A sessions.
And, of course, we welcome listeners to write to our mailbag to ask questions, answer questions that we've left unanswered, comment, or even correct us, which they do. They email us with fervor. They email us. We bring it onto the show. We equalize that message for all of our listeners, past, present, and future.
Yeah, and I think that accessibility to us and the fact that we communicate directly with our listeners, I think that adds to that sense of community. I think that helps us bring those listeners together from across the entire globe. And as mind-boggling as it is for us to believe, we do bring people together from, 100 countries?
Well, more than that, but I think a lot of those have got to be bots. I mean, what I did is I looked at the list and picked out any country that had more than 1,000 downloads, and it's something like 80-something, if that's your cutoff.
Yeah.
I mean, where you clearly have listeners.
Yeah. So bringing those folks together and creating that community with the help of our social media spaces so that they can actually communicate with each other as well as us.
Yeah, I mean, we do. We create something that's evergreen. It brings people together in time. And, of course, it keeps current listeners at the same pace. It creates that chronological unity for people who are keeping up with the show by reading 7 to 8 pages at a time.
Yeah, and although we keep saying we, it's not really us.
No.
I mean, if you're up here, out there thinking, look at these guys up here talking about themselves, we're talking about our medium, podcasting, which we're just talking about it from our own experience.
And I should say that we are not normally comfortable talking about ourselves.
No,
we don't do that.
Yeah.
So, but it is what podcasting does, and the fact that our podcast is able to do this, or that podcasting, I should say, is able to do that, and we're just able to talk about it from what we've experienced.
We're just the guys with the
years.
Microphones, but podcasting has helped us bring that community together, and that's been really cool.
Now, we've recently been preparing material for our 111st episode, which we just recorded and we'll be releasing next month. We decided to make it easy on ourselves to do a clip show. We asked our listeners to send in their favorite moments from all of our episodes so that we could pick our favorites from that list, replay them, and talk about them, sort of a little director's commentary.
It was really easy for me because I didn't have to edit all those clips. And put them into
exactly. You're not the one who had to go through and pick up everyone and edit them all. And
But it's been amazing to see the common ground in people's favorite moments. We've got a handful of jokes that we thought were funny, and people seem to agree.
Well, at least 2 or 3.
Yeah, a couple. There was actually one gag that was nominated 15 times. That was pretty cool.
The Gollum GPS.
But more than that, we've had people pick out some of our readings that we thought were really powerful. We've had people pick out some of our insights.
Yeah, discussion moments, absolutely.
We thought, well, here's something cool that I found in the work, and people connected to that.
Yeah, people who were blown away. I'm thinking of one particular example where they said, I've been reading Lord of the Rings for 25 years, and I never thought about that passage that way. You've changed the way I look at this story. That's amazing.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that was amazing to hear. Yeah.
You know, we honestly didn't set out to create a community. We didn't think that that was even a possibility. We just wanted to talk about our favorite book with our mics on, and we kind of hoped that a few people would listen. But if the submissions for our 11th are any indication, we really have created a common experience for our listeners that has brought them together. It's a place where everybody's welcome to pull up that mead bench decorated with gold, listen along, and join the party.
We probably should actually start doing that at some point, actually mailing out gold mead benches to people who listen to the show.
No, they need to come to us. I think you have one in your studio. I have one in mine.
There you go.
That'll work.
But because our podcast is out there for everyone to listen to and join in any time, it's open to all. Anyone who wants to is welcome to join that community, to pull up a bench and listen along and hopefully be entertained and hopefully learn something about the stories that have brought us together. And that's why we think of it as our digital Mead-Hall.
That's right. I mean, after all, we have story, we have song, we have revelry. Plenty of revelry. We even have a strong sense of companionship among our community of listeners. And I will say, though, that we do not put out bedding and bolsters at night for our thanes.
No, we don't. And we also don't usually have feasting and drinking.
Sadly.
But every once in a while we get a chance to do that when we come to something like this. So,
yeah.
In fact, it's our understanding that there's a dinner tonight. So hopefully we'll see some of you guys there.
A little feasting there, huh?
Yeah. But
all right.
That's it for now, and we'll happily take any questions.
Okay, do we have any questions? We only have time for a few, so we can get to that feasting and drinking. So, Jamie.
Oh, sorry. Since you said you only have time for a few, don't answer this. But how do elves smell?
Does that mean what is their scent?
Yeah.
Or how do they smell?
Yeah, not how do they
not
smell.
with their olfactory organs.
I know I differ from Corey on this because Corey's got a footnote on this in his book Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. But my take on it was, and I really explored it in an essay a few years ago, so I'm not sure I remember all the details. But
one of our ponderings. It's available on our website.
I kind of think they smell like just purity, like clean air.
I thought you said they smelled like, was it? No, fruits and apples. Apples was one of them.
No, I think I said the drink.
Oh, yeah, you were talking about the drink that they left for the hobbits.
Yeah,
that we in the next episode discovered was probably Mirrivore.
Right. So at first I thought it probably smelled like apples,
honey mead.
And then I remembered it was Mirrivore, which is probably a honey mead. So I thought, okay, that probably smells like honey. But I thought elves themselves smell just like kind of clean air. And
okay.
Yeah,
I can buy that.
Yeah.
Yeah. They certainly smell better than dwarves.
I had a reason for it. I can't remember exactly what it was. But.
All right.
So how do you respond to people who are negative or, don't agree with something you're saying or people that are trolls? Do you address them? Do you address them or do you ignore them?
You turn them into stone.
It depends. Yeah. I turn them into stone. That's right. I keep them talking until daylight.
We keep them preoccupied until the sun comes up.
We don't. I have to say we don't have very many. I mean, we've had some negative reviews, but there's no real way to interact with a negative review. We've had a few corrections, and those are easy to take. There are a few folks who maybe don't like our style. I get that. We're not for everybody. I totally understand. We're far too silly for like the hardcore academic, and there are going to probably be some folks who think we're too much of a book purist. If they really love the movies, we don't bash on them much except for The Hobbit. But
that is perfectly
all the time.
Justified.
Yeah, every single time we can. But there are some who find that troubling, and so they don't like the show. But they typically they disappear. Probably the only subject that we've had any serious contention on is how badly we beat up Feanor. So we do have a few Feanor defenders who come and they'll try to throw things out there and tell us how terrible we are for not understanding. He loved his father, don't you know?
Yeah, that was worth killing an entire.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, I think the analogy I drew was like if somebody broke into your house, stole your jewels that you made yourself. I mean, you're really good craftsmen. Stole your most valuable possessions that you made yourselves and drove away, maybe in your car. And you go to your neighbors and you say, "Neighbor, please, I need a car. Can I take your car? I want to go chase this guy." I don't think that's a wise idea. Why don't we just call the police? I'm going to kill you and your whole family.
Right.
I mean, that's Feanor right there.
Yeah. And then he takes the ships.
And then he takes the car and burns it when he gets to the end of the road.
I mean, come on. What is that?
Just to spite you.
Just to spite them. Just to spite the people who came with him.
Right.
Just because they wouldn't kill everybody with him.
Half the people who came with him. Right, exactly. So, it doesn't take us long to deal with them, but it's interesting. I try to take those negative moments and turn them, like we just did here, into something humorous. I think that's probably, humor is always a great way to kind of diffuse the situation, but we don't have too many folks that engage with the podcast directly like that. It's mostly people that interact with us in other groups, and some of them don't even know who we are, and that's kind of fun.
Yeah, we really don't have that many trolls. I think
we really don't. No trolls, really.
No,
we just have a few fan or defenders. Which is
I mean, I think that
unconscionable.
The Tolkien fan base, there's just a lot of decent people out there.
There really are,
and
that's the thing. There just aren't very many orcs in this community.
And for the most part, even if people are disagreeing with us, they're incredibly polite about it.
We don't have much time, you said? I want to make sure that after we ask the last question, we have a little bit of time to do maybe some Gollum GPS stuff.
Oh, yeah,
I think
absolutely.
we should. Okay.
But when you do have a troll, you ask him to introduce you at your keynote.
Oh, man.
I thought he was very nice.
I thought it was so kind.
It was very, very
that
kind.
was really
kinder than we deserved.
Well done. So the GPS thing, for those of you who don't, how many of you have actually heard that little sketch? Wow. Okay, maybe I should ask this question because we asked this question at MythMoot and we were embarrassed by how few people raised their hands. How many people are actually listeners of the show?
Wow.
Okay, great.
I'm supposed to raise my hand for that?
I guess every once in a while. I have to listen to it. I edit the darn thing. Okay, so that's actually, in a way, good because this will still be new to folks.
Should we let them just go
find it? No, come on. They're live. They should get a little something out of it. I mean, I could do the... let's see. Hold on. Let me think. One day, lad, all this will be yours.
Yeah, and then Ungoliant came in with
the kittens.
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that. We got to do the GPS.
There's like a 2-minute outtake on our website of
seriously,
that.
Go to our website, theprancingponypodcast.com. Not only can you get information on how to subscribe to the show, but you'll also be able to check something out that you can't find in the RSS feed, and that is our outtakes page, filled with hilarious moments, like the time when I could not figure out how to say the mountain, also known as Oyolose, and I kept pronouncing it by its less-known Aztec version, Taniquetl. And it was really, the problem was I couldn't get past it because I'd made it a joke. And so then I was trying to say it in a very serious moment.
And then I just started laughing at it before you even would say it. But the Gollum GPS thing, it came out of...
totally out of nowhere. We didn't have any notes.
No, we didn't plan it.
We were talking about how Bilbo was following
Chapter
Gollum.
5 of The Hobbit, when Bilbo is following Gollum out of the tunnel.
And we thought,
and Gollum is kind of counting passages, trying to remember like how many...
2 precious, 3, 2 on the right.
And we just came up with like, what if you had a
Wouldn't
Gollum
it be an
voice
interesting
on your
GPS?
Yeah, and you could just have things like...
Turn left at the light, precious. No, turn right. Turn right. It missed the turn, precious. It missed the turn. It must go back.
Yeah, it was great stuff.
And then we went on from there.
Yeah, we totally went on from there. I'm trying to remember exactly where we went on because getting applause is something we don't usually do.
I know.
But, we had these, it just kept on going. We decided that as bad as Gollum would be, that Treebeard would be far worse.
Right.
In 2 miles.
Was it there? Is it there, Treebeard? Is it there? Is it there?
Turn.
Did I just pass it up, Treebeard?
You have missed the turn.
Yeah.
And then of course you're driving by and you see these lovely forests and I remember when these trees were but saplings, if they might be the Entwives. And then of course the problem is when you start going too fast, he says,
"Don't be hasty."
Right.
Hasty or not, that's going to wrap up our live TexMoot appearance recorded earlier this year. But we hope it got you thinking about the future of online communities and podcasting and oral literature. But really, we just hope you enjoyed it, because we did.
Absolutely. We had a wonderful time at TexMoot, especially getting to meet so many of our listeners. And we look forward to the next Moot, which for us is likely to be Tolkien 2019 in Birmingham. So hope to see you there. But in the meantime, please be sure to join us again next week as we finally arrive at our namesake and at the sign of the Prancing Pony.
The folks around that bar should probably know us pretty well by now.
I imagine they do, yeah.
Yeah. Well, folks, thanks again for listening, and thank you for making our common room on Facebook such a wonderful place to spend time. We want all of you to be a part of this conversation, and it doesn't stop when the episode ends. So see the comments, questions, corrections, and more on Facebook at the Prancing Pony Podcast, on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod, and on Instagram at Prancing Pony Pod.
And a very special thank you to our patrons at the Keir Dance contribution tier. DeMay in Alaska, James in Virginia, Tamsin in Minnesota, Emily in Texas, and Chad in Texas, who we actually got to meet at TexMoot. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you all so much. And folks, make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe to the show through iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing as always, don't forget to send your thoughts and comments or your recollections of The Wanderer to Barnleman at theprancingponypodcast.com. And we'll try to get him into our next show. Well, a little over an hour, definitely far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
Farewell, friends.